So I actually don't have any slides. For anyone that was really hoping for a PowerPoint heavy presentation, I don't have one of those. What I've got instead is I just wanted to show a couple of things that people kind of forget that you can do with JavaScript without actually, having to include a heap of different libraries. Part of this talk was from another talk I gave where I was talking about the concept of vanilla.js. If you're not familiar with vanilla.js, I've actually got it open on the screen at the moment. This is the source code for vanilla.js. It's 0 bytes compressed. 0 bytes minified. It's slightly larger when you gzip it. It's because the gzip header is kind of has to be served. But this is the content of vanilla.js. And the idea when I was giving this talk last time was, let me just open up this folder. No, that's not going to work. Is I wanted to talk about how to deal with something that we very commonly deal with in web development, and that is querying the DOM. And the most common way that people will do this is the first thing they'll do on a project is they'll go install package jQuery. That's the very first thing. I can't count the number of times they've been on a project where it's like, okay, so we're going to need jQuery, and no code has been written yet. It's like the first thing we've got to do is include jQuery because we can't build a web app without jQuery. So I want to show you how you can actually build the basis of what's really fundamental to jQuery, which is the selector engine, without having to first install jQuery or Sizzle to be more exact. So rather than sitting here and watching me type a lot of code, I've actually pre-written some snippets for this. So the first thing I'm starting with is a JavaScript closure scope. So the reason we do this is so anything that we write won't be leaked out to the global variables. So in JavaScript, implicit variables become things that are globally scoped, and global variables, global functions, and all that kind of stuff are bad in pretty much every programming language. So I've got a little closure scope that I've set up here, and passing in the window object that becomes an exports. I've just named it exports at the top because that's kind of a common convention when working with things like Node and other asynchronous module loaders that you could be using on the web. So here is jQuery, or at least the most common things that people are doing with jQuery. This is that function, at least stripped down to the bare minimum that you can do. This is a dollars function. It is going to use the document object and use query selector all. That's the main thing that people are going to be doing off there, is using query selector all to pass in some form of a CSS selector that will then in turn be converted into a series of DOM elements that are found on screen. So we've got a bunch of unit tests here that I will zoom into. So I currently got 9 failing unit tests, and just by doing that, that's immediately 4 of my tests are passing. So here's my test file. So you see it's doing things like finding an element by a CSS class, finding element with multiple classes, finding elements based off of their ID. This kind of stuff that's what query selector all is all about. It's about querying the DOM using CSS selectors. So this is supported in every browser from, I think, IE 8 upwards. Actually, no, sorry, IE 9 upwards. I don't think query selector all was in IE 8. But really, if you think about you building a mobile site, you're building something you're targeting iPhone, Droid, Windows Phone. So you're targeting what is close to about Safari 5, which is 2 years old now. You're querying God knows what version of a browser that's running on Android, and IE 10 on Windows Phone. So these are browsers that have been released within the last couple of years. They're going to have these capabilities. Do you actually need the 30K download that jQuery adds to someone that's going to be on a 3G connection? Think about what you're doing to start with. The problem is, though, query selector all returns us a node list, and node lists are live representations of the DOM. So as soon as our DOM changes, the results in that query selector all result will also change. So I can convert this into an array by using array.prototype.slice. So I'm just caching that up on line 4, and then using the call method of that function. So modifying what I want to pass into that. Slice is really cool because it will allow you to pass in array-like objects and convert them into actual arrays. So an array-like object is something that, well, jQuery is an array-like object. It has a bunch of numerical properties on it, which is synonymous with indexes. It has a length property. That's really all you need to be able to convert something into an array. You need to have numerical indexes and a length. You need to know how you could for loop over this to a particular length and then get values out at that particular point. So that's what slice can do. And all of a sudden, we've turned that from being a node list, which is a slightly larger memory footprint, but also more dynamic. So if the DOM changes, the node list can change, to something that is now static. And if we manipulate this, we don't have to worry about that changing in ways that we're not expecting. So refreshing my tests, nothing really changes there. Now, if we want to turn this into something that actually looks a bit more like jQuery, if you're not aware, jQuery is actually not an array, even though you've got numerical indexes and all that kind of stuff. It's actually an object that has numerical properties, which it's just an array-like object. So here's how you can then convert that array into an array-like object. So on line 7 to 9, I'm creating an object that just has a length property that matches the length of our original selector. And then I can just for loop over the list of nodes that we got, and then output, and then modify that JavaScript object, and then we return that at the end. So now we've got an object that, if we were to say modify the object's prototype, we could manipulate what that is without modifying the way arrays work within JavaScript, because you kind of don't want to futz too much with arrays themselves. That's rather a core concept. But for loops aren't particularly exciting. So there's other ways we could do this. We can do this with reduce. So pretty much any browser from IE9 onwards, so like 2010, has support for functional programming concepts off of arrays. Things that are very synonymous with link. So select, where, and aggregate are the concepts of map, filter, and reduce. If you've done functional programming, you'll probably be very familiar with those kind of concepts. And you can do really cool things with reduce. So reduce, the first argument is what you're going to be returning from the function. So in this case, I am invoking the reduce method on my array, saying on line 14, I'm passing in the object that I want to be modifying, and then the first argument for that is going to be an item in the array. So we'll progress through that, and then finally we get the index. So I can do what I was doing in that for loop, but I can do that inside of a new JavaScript function. So if you wanted to do like this kind of object modifications quite frequently, you could put this function outside, so it doesn't have to be an anonymous function. Browsers, the browser JavaScript engines will then optimize for that function and be able to deal with it in a slightly more optimized way than having to do for loops that it's got to interpret every single time. So still nothing's changing in our tests. We're still just working with an array-like object, which is all our tests are really concerning themselves with. But we probably want to do something a bit more with it. I mean, it's really cool that we can get an array that we could map over. So we convert it from one type to another. We can then do a filter if we want to find child nodes and things like that. But with jQuery, obviously, there's a lot of these helper methods already written for us. So, whoops. Oh, sorry. I'm slightly ahead of myself. One of these tests, if I find one down here, okay, so this test here I've got on the screen, that's if you want to pick a query from a particular point in the DOM tree. Not every time you want to query for elements is going to be off body. So what if you're slightly further down the body? Well, we want to be able to provide a context to that kind of a selector. So I will just do BT6 and indent that. So here we go, I've modified that query to now allow you to pass in a context as the second argument. But because JavaScript arguments, you don't have to provide them, they're implicitly undefined. And did you provide me a context? Okay, we'll use that when we do a query select all call. Otherwise, we'll fall back to document. So this means that we can query from any point within the DOM tree. Or if we don't provide a context, we'll just immediately query from the top. So there we go. It's one more test pass. Now, say we wanted to be able to query from an existing collection further down into the DOM tree. That's where a method like find would come in handy, and that's something that's available off jQuery. You have an existing selector, and then you do find to find any descendants that matches an additional selector. So there's the skeleton for find, and I will just augment my object down here. Find to have a find. And it's still going to fail because obviously I haven't implemented that. But my find method is, I'm not sure where the find method is used, but there's a test that covers that. Yeah? Believe in the unit tests. Oops, went ahead of myself. Nope, okay. I obviously forgot one of my things. So here is how you could use array modifications. Actually have this out of order, I think. There we go. I will come back to 08 in a second. So this is how you would implement find. So I've created an array that I'm going to return at the end of this call. Using a for loop to, I've lost my matches as well, so I will just open the existing version and talk about that. This is why you don't write your code snippets at like 10 PM. That's a really bad idea. Here's one I prepared earlier. So, here's our find method. Oh, actually, no, I was doing that right. I did have them in the correct order. So, the first thing we want to do is we want to get all the items that would match that selector from the current position down. So the first thing I'm doing on line 36 to 38 is taking the items, which is something captured within this closure scope. So that's the original selector that we did, is the list of items. We then use the map function, which is like select in link. We then iterate over that, and then we pass the selector that we were given and the item that we're currently working with back to our dollars function. So we reuse our dollars function, and jQuery does this internally itself quite a lot. It just reuses its own functions to then continue itself down the chain. So here's that for loop example that I had up a moment ago, where we create our return object, which is going to be an array. We iterate through the matches, and then we add the matches back onto the original return. Basically, I've got a collection of collections that I want to flatten into a single one. It's kind of ugly because we've got nested for loops here that we've got to keep tracking at multiple depths. And this is something that you can, again, use reduce for. We can use reduce to do what the link zip method would do. I've actually never used link zip in production, but it's actually really powerful because what it allows you to do, it collapses arrays into just a single array. It's either zip or unzip that does that, I forget which. But this is what you would do. So we take our array, we then convert it into, we just make sure that it is an array of arrays, and then we return that concatenated onto the previous array that we had passed in. We start off with an empty array, so we build that up, and that's what we return at the end. So now we can do, the tests aren't going to work because it's in an entirely different file, so I want, yep, so there's our matches. There we go, whatever test I had monitoring find has now passed. So you can do then smarter things about, well, how would you deal with, say, an ID? You obviously, if you're working with IDs and classes, the browser is actually optimized for doing queries against these. You've got document.getElement by ID and document.getElements by class name. So you want to leverage those rather than having to rely on query selector all, because query selector all is a bit slower, more noticeable obviously on low powered devices, tablets, mobile devices, etc. So you want to try and use the ones that are optimized, class name or ID selector, if you know that you're going to be working with just that kind of a selector. So this is a simplified version of the regexes that you would use to detect whether it's a single class or a single ID that you're providing as a selector. And if I come down here, and 12, there we go, I'll expand that out. That is how we would do it. I mean, it's pretty standard logical coding that we've got here. We do a test on one of the selector against class names. If it's not a class name, okay, well, is it going to be an ID? If it's an ID, then we use document.getElement by ID. If it's neither of those, then we'll just fall back to query selector all and then continue on. This is what Sizzle will do internally to do its determination of whether or not you want to do an ID-based selector, a class name selector, or a CSS3 selector. It will then do some additional stuff on CSS3 selectors to be able to provide custom selectors. So you could create your own custom selector that will then be usable with inside the CSS selector. But that's immediately you break out of the JavaScript runtime engine to start doing that, and it starts getting a bit slower. And I don't remember, since CSS3, I don't really remember the last time I needed a custom CSS selector. So now that we've seen, the basics of something that you could do with JavaScript, that people kind of forget that JavaScript itself has actually got a lot of these things that you're probably doing that maybe you don't need to bring in these big libraries to deal with. And one of the really core concepts of JavaScript is manipulating arrays. The problem with arrays is that they're all eager evaluators. So when you do .map, .reduce, it will have to process the entire collection through the map before it can pass it to reduce. With .NET people, so we're used to link, where link is lazy evaluating. So each item will go through the entire query chain before the next item starts going. And that's because JavaScript has iterators. C# has iterators. And up until, well, about 2 months ago or something like that, no browser in their JavaScript engine had actually implemented iterators. It's something that's been proposed for the next version of JavaScript. So I was like, I really want an excuse to play with this. So my idea was, well, let's build link in JavaScript. And it's not that far out of concept, really. Right? We want to manipulate arrays. Things like underscore and Lodash do that. You can do a lot of those things off jQuery itself. But being a .NET developer, what if you wanted to make it look just like .NET? So I have started doing that because, reasons. I actually used that when talking to a client the other day, which was probably not the best idea, but oh well. So here on line 10 is what's changed to make JavaScript iterators work. So we've got this function followed by a star. That tells the JavaScript runtime that this is an iterable function, this is a generator function, and then inside of that we're going to be dealing with an iterator. So we're going to yield return, or in this case we just yield. We don't actually have to yield return like you do in .NET. So what's really cool is now we can start doing things that are lazy evaluated. And I'm running out of time, so I will just quickly bring up the tests. At the moment, this only works in Firefox nightlies. At least all my tests only work in Firefox nightlies. Hey, I said this is something coming in the next version of JavaScript. If you're expecting it to work right now, you'd be doing something wrong. The reason my tests only work in Firefox nightlies is because I'm actually using the fat arrow syntax as well, which is not in any browser, any JavaScript engine except Firefox nightlies. And apparently I have actually broken all of my tests. Awesome. All Firefox nightlies have recently changed, and I haven't run my tests for quite a while. So we'll move away from the tests, or at least move away from running the tests. So my goal was to basically make it look something like this. So if you have a look at this thing on line 5, this is how you calculate prime numbers. This is calculating prime numbers between 3 and 10. I actually wrote this during the keynote at DDD Melbourne when the guy that wrote LinkPad was on stage talking about how to do parallelism in C#, and his example was building a prime number generator using a link statement, and he wrote this. I'm like, I can totally do that in JavaScript, and sitting there for the rest of the keynote writing it. But my goal was to make this look very much like C#. So we created a numeral range. We have a where function. Because this is using the fat arrow syntax, it becomes a lambda statement like we're used to in C#. So we've got a lambda statement inside of that, a new numeral range, which then passes the function inside of that, and we've got alls, and this is like cyclic complexity really high because it's a really difficult query to just kind of look at. But the cool thing is that that is actually lazy evaluating. So if inside of my prime number calculator, I wanted to break at any point, break out of the for of loop that I'm using here, be cool. I could. I wouldn't have any issues with me doing that, and it wouldn't continue to evaluate the rest of the collection. So if I had 10,000 items in my collection, I could break at a particular point, and then like come back to a later point, or just ignore part of it. working with 10,000 items is kind of an abstract concept, but where would it be useful? If you're doing paging of data tables, like you want to build up a data table. You don't want to process the entire data table to build up the first one and then the number of pages. You want to just process the first X number of items, and this is where this kind of lazy evaluation will really be cool. And since I am pretty much out of time, I'm just going to show you this really fun thing that I've been doing. It is the idea of implementing the task parallel library in JavaScript. Again, this came from the idea of wanting to be able to do things. It came actually from the guy that wrote LinkPad asked me whether or not my prime number calculation would be able to be done in parallel. I'm like, not currently, but I reckon you could. And turns out that you actually can do things like dynamic parallelism in JavaScript. So, I mean, it doesn't look like TPL, obviously. This was something that I just very quickly did. But what I've got here is I've got an array of items. I then have a function that I want to execute against that array, but I want to split that over n number of processes. JavaScript is inherently single-threaded, so everything runs on the UI thread, unless you put things in web workers. So what this does under the hood is spins up web workers on the fly, the number of web workers you've requested, in this case 2. It will then take that function, pass that across to the web worker. It will then split your data evenly across them and say process. They will then turn around and go, okay, I'm done. Here's your result set. I'm done. Here's your result set. Give you that back. It will then give you a single result. So the aggregation of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is 15. I execute this across 2 different processes, and the test does work. That one is on GitHub, and I think I'm out of time, so I'm unfortunately not going to be able to show you the code. But it's kind of a cool idea, and I want to see whether or not you can integrate this with the generator stuff that I showed, so you could actually have p-link in JavaScript. Yeah! Thank you all.